Thanksgiving in Vermont always smelled like cedar sage and old grudges. I'd barely taken my seat at the long wooden table when my mother Elaine lifted her wine glass and tapped it with her ring, demanding everyone's attention. "She's the biggest failure in this family," she announced, nodding toward me, as if I were a stain on the tablecloth. My sister Melanie tilted her head and let out a soft, delighted laugh. "Right, Clara has never achieved anything. Not one real thing." Aunts went quiet. Cousins exchanged looks. Even the neighbors, invited for reasons I still didn't understand, paused mid-bite. I felt the familiar burn in my chest. Not anger, not sadness. Just the old, heavy numbness that came from being the family's designated disappointment. I swallowed it the way I always had, silently. Then my father Ray, who'd been flipping channels with the remote like he always did to avoid conflict, suddenly jerked upright. "Oh my God! Turn on the TV! Turn it on!" The screen shifted. Football disappeared. Breaking news flashed across the bottom. The East Room of the White House filled the screen. Reporters angled cameras. The president approached the podium. And then my face appeared. "Recipient of the National Medal of Science," the announcer read, Dr. Clara Whitmore. The room froze. My mother's wine glass slipped from her hand and hit the table with a sharp clatter. Melanie stared at the screen as if it were an optical illusion. My cousins gasped. Someone whispered, "Is that really her? My full name? My picture? My work?" For a long moment, no one breathed. I just sat there, hands folded neatly in my lap, finally watching the truth take a shape they could not deny. I'd driven 3 hours from Boston through icy November winds to be here. A part of me already knew returning to Vermont meant swallowing the same old dismissiveness wrapped in holiday politeness. But hearing the neighbor at the driveway whisper, "Your mom said you're struggling again, dear," had carved a quiet bruise before I even walked through the door. Now that same neighbor stood at the window, staring in disbelief as national television replayed the years of work I'd never told any of them about. While the president spoke about quantum infrastructure and the stabilizer system, I'd spent 5 years building the dining room, filled with the thick silence of people watching their long-held assumptions die in real time. My mother finally found her voice. "This must be some kind of mistake." But it wasn't. The broadcast rolled footage of emergency rooms in rural America that had stayed online during winter storms thanks to Q-Core. It showed elderly care facilities lit by backup grids my team helped stabilize. It showed testimonies from doctors who said lives were saved. Lives they never imagined I was capable of impacting. I caught sight of my youngest cousin standing in the doorway whispering to his sister, but Aunt Elaine said she'd dropped out of school. My throat tightened, not because of their words, but because of how effortlessly those lies had lived. In my place, their version of me had been the only one they ever believed. My father kept staring at the TV screen as if the remote might reverse what he was seeing. His voice was barely audible. I had no idea. Of course he hadn't. I'd learned years ago that anything I told him somehow never made it past my mother's filter. It was easier to keep my world separate than try to make them see me. But tonight, the President of the United States did it for me. I stood slowly, needing air. The room parted around me like I was a stranger. I could hear them begin to chatter, panic, confusion, disbelief. But I didn't look back. I walked into the hallway. My footsteps echoed in the small house that had never felt like home. A childhood photo hung crooked on the wall, Melanie in the center glowing, framed perfectly. I stood half cut off at the edge, barely visible. Of course I was. I hadn't been fully seen here since the day I learned how to read. Inside the living room behind me, my mother's voice rose shrill and frantic. Why didn't she tell us? Why would she hide something like this? And then quieter but sharper. What are we supposed to say to the neighbors? Always the neighbors, always the image, never me. I stepped onto the porch just as a cluster of townspeople hurried toward the house. Flashlights bobbed. Someone shouted, "Is that your daughter on TV?" The scientist, I felt the air sting my cheeks cold and clean compared to the suffocating heat of the dining room. Inside chairs, scraped someone tripped, and my mother hissed something sharp enough to slice through drywall. The faces on the porch glowed with curiosity and wonder. They were seeing something new, perhaps seeing me for the first time. Behind me, Melanie's voice cracked. I didn't turn, but I heard it clearly. How long has she been doing all this? My father's voice followed, trembling. I think this is who she's been all along. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of their shock wash over me. Not to savor it, not to punish them, but to finally understand in my bones something I'd never let myself believe. Their version of me had never been real. I opened my eyes and looked out over the porch lights, the neighbors gathering the reporters down the street who'd begun to arrive early after the broadcast. They were all waiting for me. Inside, my mother shouted, "Clara, you come back inside this instant. We need to talk about how this makes our family look, as if my life existed to decorate hers." I didn't turn around. Instead, I stepped off the porch and into the crisp night air, my breath steady, my heart strangely calm. They thought the shock was that I'd been honored. They thought the surprise was that I'd succeeded. But as I walked toward the cluster of people calling my name, I knew something they didn't. This moment was only the beginning of what they had buried. And I was finally fully ready to unearth everything. When I slipped back into the hallway, the house felt smaller than I remembered, like the walls had been quietly closing in for years, waiting for the night everything would finally snap. The muffled voices from the porch faded behind the front door, replaced by the distant echo of my family's panic. I climbed the stairs slowly, one hand brushing the banister I used to cling to as a child when being invisible was safer than being noticed. At the landing, my eyes caught on a familiar hallway display, a collage of childhood photos. Every square inch was filled with Melanie. Melanie holding trophies. Melanie at cheer camp. Melanie blowing out birthday candles. Melanie posing with relatives I barely remembered. I scanned the wall for myself and found only one picture, me at 7, standing so close to the frame's edge that half my face was cropped out. Even in photographs, there'd been no room for me. My breath tightened. I had forgotten how much it hurt to be erased in the place that should have held me the most. I stepped into my old room. The door creaked, the same soft whine it made when I used to sneak inside and cry into my pillow so no one would hear. The room smelled faintly of pine soap and dust. The posters that once hung on the walls, planets, constellations, quantum diagrams drawn in childish excitement, were long gone. In their place, boxes labeled Melanie's trophies were stacked neatly along the wall. My own childhood, like everything else, had been boxed out. I sat on the edge of my old bed, letting the quiet wrap around me. For the first time since I'd arrived, the numbness from downstairs began to thaw. And with it came the memories, sharp, clear, and unwelcome. When did I first become invisible? I closed my eyes and slipped backward through time, back to the nights when Melanie got brand new dolls while I received whatever she'd grown bored of. Back to school report days when my straight A's earned a dismissive good. Keep it up, but Melanie's B- was praised as proof of her potential. Back to birthday parties where Melanie was the center of every photo, confetti framing her perfectly, while I was the extra body holding plates, keeping quiet, trying not to ruin the picture. Even the church talent show, all I'd wanted was to show my homemade science project. A miniature electric grid I'd built from scrap wires and cardboard. I'd worked on it for weeks, but when I carried it to the car, my mother frowned. "Don't bring that, Clara. Melanie's singing performance should be the highlight. Let her have her moment. My moment didn't matter." I opened my eyes, staring at the shadows the boxes cast across my wall. There were hundreds of memories, little cuts that eventually taught me not to speak up, not to want, not to take space. But there were bigger wounds, too. The kind that never quite stopped bleeding beneath the surface. I remembered sitting in the guidance counselor's office at 15 after winning a regional science competition. The professor judging the event had offered to mentor me, maybe even help me prepare for college-level research opportunities. It had felt like a door opening, but when I told my mother, she barely looked up from the kitchen sink. You don't need some professor filling your head with unrealistic dreams. You should stay focused on helping out at home. Then she refused to drive me to the meetings. Family comes first, she'd said, even as she packed Melanie and all her cheer gear into the car to drive her to practices across town. Years later, I learned my mother had actually called the professor and told him I was no longer interested. That was the first time I felt something inside me close. But it wasn't the last. Downstairs, I heard my name spoken, sharply, angrily, followed by Melanie's voice cracking. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was familiar, fear dressed up as indignation. I'd heard it my entire childhood every time Melanie thought I might get something she couldn't. When I was 16, Melanie had found my MIT application forms spread across my desk. She had picked one up, scanned it, then glanced at me with a strange mixture of jealousy and disdain. "Why would MIT want you?" she'd asked, tossing it onto my bed. I'd told myself she was just being a bratty teenager. I didn't know then what role she'd eventually play in the truth that was coming. The floor creaked outside my room, pulling me back to the present. I turned, expecting Elaine or Melanie, but no one was there. Just the soft, eerie groan of the old house settling. My gaze drifted to the corner of the dresser where an envelope sat half hidden under a stack of old sweaters. It hadn't been there earlier. My mother's handwriting curved across the front. For Clara. I hesitated, unsure whether to reach for it. Something about its presence felt wrong. Too intentional. Too heavy with meaning. I picked it up. It was heavier than a normal letter, something metal shifted inside. Before I could open it, voices floated up the stairs. Low, urgent whispers. She wasn't supposed to find out. We have to keep the story straight. The MIT thing, don't bring that up. My pulse hammered. I stepped out of my room and moved quietly down the hallway. The staircase banister was cool under my hand as I leaned closer, listening. Aunt Linda's voice trembled. "Elaine, this is getting out of hand. What if she learns she won't?" My mother snapped. "Not now. Not tonight." Melanie's voice broke. "But Mom," she saw the message. "Then you delete the rest." Elaine's tone cracked like a whip. My breath caught. Message. What message? I held the envelope tighter, a strange dread settling in my chest. This family had hidden so much, buried so much. And tonight had blown a hole straight through the ground beneath them. I took a slow breath, forcing calm. When I stepped into the kitchen doorway, their voices collided with silence. 3 pairs of eyes swung toward me, guilty, frightened, furious. Elaine straightened, smoothing her hair. "Clara, we need to talk about what you said to the reporters." "I didn't say anything," I replied, softly, feeling the weight of the envelope like a stone in my palm. Melanie's eyes darted to it, then away. She swallowed hard. Aunt Linda muttered something and slipped out of the room, unable to face me. The tension thickened. Even the refrigerator hum seemed to hold its breath. I finally spoke. "I'm going upstairs." No one stopped me. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the envelope. My name, my mother's handwriting, something metal inside. My fingers trembled slightly as I slid a thumb beneath the flap. Not yet. Something in me wasn't ready. Not until I cleared the fog in my chest. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling that once held glow in the dark stars. They'd peeled away long ago, just like the pieces of me I'd left behind in this house. All my life, I'd thought the silence between me and my family was something I created. My choice, my fault. But tonight, their frantic whispers, the panic in their eyes, the message they hoped I wouldn't see, it all pointed to a different truth. The silence wasn't mine. It was theirs. Their lies. Their secrets. Their fear of who I might become. I rolled onto my side, curling around the envelope. Some truths break you, others free you, and something inside that envelope was waiting to do one or the other. I closed my eyes, bracing myself. Downstairs, I heard someone cry. Someone curse. Someone slam a door. This house had finally begun to crack, and I knew whatever they'd buried, whatever they'd done tonight, was the beginning of unearthing it all. The envelope felt heavier in my hand the longer I stared at it, as if it carried the full weight of every unanswered question from my childhood. I sat in my old bedroom with the door cracked just enough to hear the house shifting below me, voices rising, falling, then collapsing into strained silence. Whatever truth waited inside that envelope could wait a moment more. My chest was too tight, my breath too thin. I needed air, even if it was only the air inside my own head. I placed the envelope on my nightstand, stood, and let my eyes travel slowly across the room. The posters were gone, but the ghosts weren't. I remembered sitting at this same spot as a teenager, hunched over textbooks while Melanie practiced songs in the living room, and my mother praised every off-key note. I remembered how this room once held my dreams, crude drawings of reactors, scribbled notes about quantum energy systems formulas, taped to the wall like secret prayers. Then the memories sharpened like film coming into focus. The year I left home, I didn't look back. I packed 2 duffel bags and boarded a bus to Boston with just enough cash to survive a month. Vermont seemed determined to keep me small. In Boston, anonymity was a gift. I waited tables, stocked shelves, cleaned laboratories, anything that paid enough for rent and textbooks. My mother called weekly, at first her voice dripping with disappointment. "Melanie says you sound stressed. Are you sure you can handle this city?" "You could always come home," she'd add, as if returning would somehow fix the pieces of me she'd helped break. The calls always ended the same way, her bragging about Melanie's new friends, Melanie's new job, Melanie's new boyfriend, before reminding me to stay grounded and not get ahead of myself. By the second year, I'd stopped calling back. It didn't matter. She told the neighbors I was working at a failing cafe, struggling as usual. She fed them a steady diet of stories about how I couldn't handle the real world, painting me as a cautionary tale. Funny how I never found the energy to correct her. Silence became easier than arguing with a narrative she loved more than the truth. I shook off the memory and sat back down on the bed, clasping my hands together. My thoughts drifted to the moment everything changed: graduate school at the Boston Institute of Applied Physics. I still remembered the first day I stepped into the basement lab, the hum of servers vibrating through concrete, the scent of cold metal and solder thick in the air. That lab became my sanctuary. I found mentors who actually saw me, not as the lesser daughter or the quiet one, but as a researcher with potential. I devoured every course on quantum stability infrastructure, modeling energy resilience. While the world talked about high-concept theory, my obsession was practical. How do you keep a hospital online when everything else goes dark? I remembered the first time I stayed up for 40 hours, straight tweaking a model that predicted grid collapses in rural hospitals. It didn't matter that I was exhausted. It didn't matter that no one praised me for it. My work began to speak louder than I ever could. Then came the storm. A brutal winter blackout hit a small hospital in western Maine. Their backup generator failed. Patients were minutes from critical failure. Our early-stage Q-Core prototype activated automatically through a pilot network. The stabilizer corrected the oscillation and bought them 14 minutes, just enough time to move patients and restart emergency systems. 19 lives were saved. I wasn't allowed to speak about it. The project was under federal confidentiality, but the hospital administrator sent a letter anyway. A simple handwritten note. "Whoever you are, you saved my husband. You are the reason I am not widowed today." I kept that letter in my desk drawer for years. It became the fuel for nights, when no one else believed in me, least of all the family I'd come from. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Instinctively, I lowered my breathing and listened. Something about returning to this house brought back old survival habits. Silence, then a soft shuffle. My heart quickened. But it wasn't someone trying to overhear me. It was the house settling. Still, I closed the door and leaned against it, letting the adrenaline fade. My mind drifted to the moment the Department of Energy contacted me. I'd been working a late shift in the lab, surrounded by glowing monitors and half-eaten protein bars, when a woman in a Navy suit appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Whitmore?" she asked. I nearly laughed. No one called me that yet. I was still defending my dissertation. 2 weeks later, I signed my first federal non-disclosure agreement. They gave me a badge, a clearance level, and a mandate to expand the stabilizer system to protect critical national infrastructure. Hospitals, elderly care facilities, rural grids, the very places most vulnerable to collapse. For the first time in my life, my silence wasn't weakness. It was required. It was power. It was protection. And it meant my family never needed to know. But the truth was more complicated. They didn't deserve to know. My mother had treated every accomplishment like a threat. Every step I took away from her control became an injury she had to correct. If I'd told her about my research, she would have twisted it into something small, something shameful, something she could use to elevate Melanie. So I built my life in secret. I built Q-Core in quiet labs on classified servers in late-night coding sessions that left my fingers trembling. I helped rural communities I'd never seen. I stabilized elderly care centers I would never visit. My work became a private universe where my mother's voice couldn't reach me. But secrets have consequences. And success makes enemies. Someone inside the energy sector noticed the impact of Q-Core, the financial threat it posed, the political leverage it offered, and the attacks began. I remembered the first anonymous message I ever received. It came 3 years ago to my secured email. "Do not involve your family." At the time, I thought it was just a paranoid warning from someone inside the agency. Now I understood someone already knew the truth about my family. Someone knew how easily they could be manipulated. A vibration buzzed against my leg. My phone lit up with a new email notification. Subject line: "They started years ago." My skin prickled. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I stood and paced the length of my room, trying to steady the storm building inside me. My family didn't just erase me. They helped bury every opportunity I ever had. They didn't just ignore my work. They provided the perfect cover for the people who wanted to destroy it. I stopped at the dresser and saw the envelope again, my mother's handwriting. Elegant, controlled, familiar. I picked it up carefully, turning it in my hands. Something metal shifted inside with a faint clink. A key. But to what I pressed my thumb beneath the flap. A knock sounded at the door, soft, hesitant. Melanie's voice followed, barely a whisper. "Clara, please. Can we talk?" My breath caught. The envelope trembled in my hand. Not yet. Not until I understood just how deep this went. I slid the envelope into my coat pocket and walked toward the door. Whatever truth they'd buried, whatever they'd hidden from me for years tonight, I was done being afraid of it. I found Melanie sitting at the edge of the living room couch, elbows on her knees, fingers twisting around her phone like she was afraid it might detonate. The glow from the screen lit her face, and when she heard my footsteps, she jerked the phone to her chest so fast she almost dropped it. Her eyes widened, guilty, startled, trembling. "Clara," she breathed, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So, congratulations, I guess." I stood in the doorway, arms crossed loosely. The house had quieted, but underneath it ran a pulse of fear, a heartbeat of secrets. "You wanted to talk." She laughed, soft, brittle. "Talk, I mean, sure. I guess we should. Since you decided to surprise us with your whole scientist thing." "My scientist thing?" I repeated, voice neutral. She straightened defensively. "Well, you didn't tell us. You didn't tell me. You didn't ask." Her face tightened. "Don't twist this. You embarrassed everyone tonight. What were we supposed to do? Just sit there while the whole town finds out you've been lying about your life?" "I never lied, Melanie." "You hid it," she snapped. I stepped further into the room. Would it have made a difference? Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked away first. Behind Melanie in the dining room, aunts and cousins hovered like spectators at a boxing match. Their faces pinched with judgment, concern, mostly curiosity. The way they shifted closer toward Melanie, forming a quiet, protective ring, was so familiar it was almost comforting in its predictability. Elaine swept in from the kitchen like a storm cloud, smoothing her hair and forcing a smile too wide to be real. "Girls," she said sharply, "let's keep our voices down. Reporters are still outside." I didn't raise my voice at all. Melanie stood abruptly, planting herself between me and the room as if she were the injured party. "You should have told us, Clara. All of us. We look ridiculous. People will think we never supported you." "You didn't," I said simply. The words landed like a slap. Gasps fluttered across the room. Melanie's face flushed deep red. "How dare you say that Mom has always—" That was when she slipped. When truth cracked through the smirk. Just like with MIT, she blurted out, "You ruined that all on your own." She stopped. Too late. Elaine's head snapped toward her. The house had quieted, but underneath it ran a pulse of fear, a heartbeat of secrets. "You wanted to talk." She laughed, soft, brittle. "Talk, I mean, sure. I guess we should. Since you decided to surprise us with your whole scientist thing." "My scientist thing?" I repeated, voice neutral. She straightened defensively. "Well, you didn't tell us. You didn't tell me. You didn't ask." Her face tightened. "Don't twist this. You embarrassed everyone tonight. The thing that changed the entire trajectory of my life." I kept my gaze fixed on Melanie. "Say it again." Her eyes darted to her phone. Her thumb tapped rapidly against the screen. She backed away from me toward the kitchen, like a child retreating to her hiding place. "Mel," I said quietly, "who are you texting?" She froze. A beat. Then she turned the phone over so I couldn't see the screen. My stomach twisted. Elaine sensed the shift and rushed to fill the air. "Clara, your sister is emotional. You need to stop cornering her." I let out a breath that felt like releasing years of swallowed truths. "I'm not cornering anyone. I'm trying to understand why my family reacts to my success like it's a threat." Melanie scoffed, though it came out broken. "Because you didn't tell us Mom said no." I cut her off. "Not Mom, you. What did you think she looked like? She wanted to speak, to scream, to run. Instead, she folded her arms tightly across her chest. I thought—" Her voice shook. "I thought you'd come back a failure. Like you always do. Like Mom said you would." Aunts gasped again. Elaine's face drained of color. There it was. The truth beneath all her smirks. I didn't flinch. And now that I'm not, Melanie's eyes glistened with something sharp, jealousy, maybe. Fear. Fear of losing the role she'd been given her whole life, the golden one, she whispered. Now everything's ruined. Elaine jolted forward. "Melanie." "That is enough." But Melanie wasn't finished. Her voice cracked like thin glass. "People will think you're better than us. Not proud, not amazed, not happy for you. Better than us." Elaine reacted first, clutching my arm with a shaking hand. "Ignore her. She's exhausted. We all are." I gently removed her hand. "Why did you say I wasn't stable enough for MIT?" Elaine's lips parted. Shock, denial, fury all flickered behind her eyes. "I never said anything like that. That soft, perfect lie." But Melanie's face told a different story. Behind Elaine's shoulder, she shook her head barely but unmistakably. "Don't say it. Don't tell her." Something inside me settled. A piece clicked into place. Another lie. Another buried truth. Aunt Linda shuffled forward awkwardly. "Maybe we should all sit down." "No," I said calmly. "Not until we stop pretending." Elaine stiffened. "Pretending what? That this is a family that supported me." Elaine's mask trembled for the first time. Her mouth worked like she was searching for the perfect words to twist this back into my fault as she always had. But before she found them, Melanie's phone buzzed sharply. Every head turned. Melanie flinched and stepped away, whispering harshly, "Stop messaging me. I said I can't talk right now." She didn't realize I was close enough to glimpse the edge of her screen before she locked it. Just 3 words glowing white in the dark, "She doesn't know." A chill rolled through me. "Melanie," I said. "Who is texting you about me?" She backed up until she hit the counter. "No one. It's nothing." Elaine grabbed her wrist. "Go upstairs." "I'm not a child," Melanie hissed. "Then stop acting like one," Elaine snapped. For the first time in my life, Melanie didn't obey her. She just stood there trembling, looking back and forth between us. The room felt full in a suffocating way, like a storm gathering inside 4 walls. Elaine whirled on me, pointing a finger. "You have no right to interrogate anyone. You've caused enough trouble tonight." I smiled. Soft, controlled, dangerous. "I haven't started." Elaine's eyes widened just a flicker. A warning shimmered beneath her panic. "Whatever secrets you're hiding," I continued, "they're coming undone, whether you like it or not." Melanie's voice came out small. "Clara, stop." "I can't," I said. "Not anymore." I turned toward the back porch. The cold air leaking through the window frame felt like relief after drowning. I walked away while the kitchen swirled with whispers, gasps, anger. Behind me, Elaine barked, "You come back here right now," but I didn't. I stepped onto the porch, letting the night swallow the noise. Through the kitchen window, Melanie lifted her phone again, her face crumpling when she saw the newest message. I moved closer unseen in the dark, just enough to see the full preview flash across her screen before she hit it. "She knows. Fix it. Fix it. Fix what." Melanie's breath hitched. She deleted the thread with frantic taps, wiping it from existence. Then she leaned on the counter, shaking hand pressed to her mouth. Fear. Not of me. Of whoever was texting her. The realization settled into my bones like ice. The danger in my life hadn't just come from my family. It had come through them. And whatever they were hiding, whatever they'd been involved in, I was done being the one left in the dark. The porch boards were cold beneath my feet, the night sharp, with November air. I leaned against the railing and let myself breathe, really breathe for the first time since the broadcast detonated my family's carefully curated lies. I replayed the message I'd seen on Melanie's phone, "She doesn't know," and every muscle in my body tightened in response. They knew something. They had always known something. "Clara," a voice called from the edge of the yard. I turned. It was Mr. Hawthorne, our elderly neighbor, bundled in a thick coat and holding a stack of newspapers under his arm. He walked slowly toward me, boots crunching over frost. I hadn't seen him in years. He lifted the bundle awkwardly. "These are for you. I thought maybe you'd want them." I frowned. "For me," he nodded, handing them over. "Your father saved them." "But your mother asked us not to bring them up. Said you wouldn't want to see them. Didn't want to embarrass you. Embarrass me." That was the word she always chose to hide behind. I flipped through the papers and froze. Front-page stories from the past several winters. Headlines splashed across the top: "Quantum Stabilizer Prevents Hospital, Blackout Local Facility, Saved by New Energy Technology Elderly Care Center, Protected During Storm Surge." The articles didn't mention my name. My work was still classified. But the descriptions were unmistakable. This was Q-Core, the early version of it anyway. The one we'd tested through small rural networks. The one that had saved those 19 lives during the winter collapse. I remembered coding that night until my fingers cramped, watching real-time data streaming in as our stabilizer reacted to the storm. I remembered holding my breath when we saw the voltage spike drop and the system worked. And I remembered being unable to tell anyone. Mr. Hawthorne cleared his throat softly. "Your father showed me these over the years. Said there was something special about what you were doing. He looked proud, honey." My chest tightened. "And my mother," he sighed. "She told the neighborhood you were struggling in Boston, that you didn't need more reminders of disappointment." My jaw clenched. Of course she did. But the truth sat warm against my palms, the clippings, the headlines, the proof that even without public credit lives had depended on what I built. "Thank you," I whispered. He patted my arm gently and shuffled back toward his porch. I turned my gaze to the newspapers again, tracing each line. The more I read, the more the past 5 years sharpened with painful clarity. The lab. The long nights. The emergency calls from rural hospitals. The letters from elderly couples thanking an unnamed scientist. The first time Q-Core prevented a chain reaction that would have shut down ICU machines. The country had no idea how close it had come to losing so much. I still remembered sitting alone in the lab after the system held through its first major crisis. There had been no celebration, no champagne, no applause, just a quiet hum of machines and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights as I realized this was what I was meant to do. Not for glory. Not for recognition. For impact. For people like Mr. Hawthorne. For families who had run out of hope. For communities forgotten by the grid. Those thoughts had carried me through the isolation, the exhaustion, the secrecy. But they hadn't protected me from the next storm. The day federal agents arrived at the lab, I thought something had gone wrong. Instead, they sat me down, slid a folder across the table, and said, "We're expanding Q-Core. Nationally. And then, you'll be working under classified conditions. You cannot speak to anyone about this. Not even family." Family. The word had felt like a bruise then. A small ache. A reminder of the reason I had moved to Boston in the first place. I never questioned the secrecy. I never questioned the silence. It was easy not to tell people who never asked. But tonight proved they weren't just uninterested. They had been working from a script I hadn't even known existed. As I flipped through the newspapers, another memory surfaced, the first time I received an internal warning. A simple, anonymous email. "Keep your circle small. The wrong eyes are watching." At the time, I thought it referred to foreign interests or private competitors digging around for sensitive data. I didn't imagine it also referred to my own mother, answering phone calls from strangers with too much interest in my future. I set the papers on the railing and closed my eyes, letting the cold air steady me. There was a heaviness in my chest, not sadness but realization. A realization that every lie Elaine told the neighbors had masked something deeper. Something intentional. I opened my eyes again when the porch light flickered, buzzing faintly. Another reminder of brittle infrastructure, the very thing my work was meant to protect. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. A new email. No sender. Subject: I know what they did. My breath caught. My fingers hovered, then tapped to open it. Inside were attachments, screenshots, memos, internal messages, and one line of text: "Look at the date of the first payment." My pulse thudded as I scrolled. Payment records. Account numbers. Transfers. The earliest transaction was time-stamped 7 years ago. The same month, my MIT application disappeared without explanation. My stomach dropped. Air thinned around me. Someone sabotaged me long before Q-Core. Long before my career meant anything. Long before anyone should have cared. I swallowed hard, throat tight. The porch door creaked behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. I recognized Samantha Brooks's calm cadence before she even spoke. "Clara," she said, stepping beside me, "we need to talk." Samantha had driven up from D.C. in the middle of the night. Her presence alone told me everything. This wasn't just a smear campaign. It was a calculated, premeditated attack. "Your inbox is compromised," she continued. "You're receiving leaked documents because someone on the inside doesn't want the consortium's lies to stick." "An insider," I whispered. "A whistleblower," she corrected. "Someone who wants the truth out." She glanced at the newspapers, then at the house behind us where shadows moved in tense patterns. "Your family is tangled in this," she said softly. "Whether they meant to be or not." I let out a breath that shook. "I know." Samantha studied me for a moment. "You've been fighting this war alone for a long time, haven't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to, she continued. We'll freeze the consortium's disinformation campaign. We'll file injunctions. We'll subpoena everyone involved. But you need to understand something. Her tone shifted firmer, sharper. They're afraid of you, Clara. Not because you're vulnerable, because you built something they can't control. They're coming after you because you exposed the truth they spent years burying. The truth. Again, that word. The porch light flickered once more, buzzing like an omen. I thought of Melanie's shaking hands, the messages, the lies, the years of being underestimated by the people who claimed to love me. I folded the newspapers, tucked them under my arm, and looked Samantha in the eye. Let them come, I said. I'm done hiding. For the first time in my life, those words didn't terrify me. They liberated me. The reporters surged toward the porch the moment Samantha and I stepped back into the yard, their lights slicing through the cold Vermont night like search beams. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, questions ricocheted in every direction. Dr. Whitmore, how does it feel to receive the National Medal of Science? Is it true your technology saved rural hospitals during last year's blackout? Did you hide your work from your family and then louder than the rest? What about the allegation that your Q-core system destabilizes the national energy market? Samantha's hand grazed my elbow, a quiet warning to stay calm, but I didn't flinch. I kept my voice level. No technology destabilizes the grid by preventing it from collapsing. The reporter blinked, as if he hadn't expected a response. Before anyone could recover, the front door swung open. Elaine barreled down the porch steps with a radiant, too-wide smile stretched across her face. There she is, she chirped loudly. Our brilliant daughter. We couldn't be prouder. She clung to my arm like she'd earned the right to. Such a wonderful moment for our family. Family. She said it like a brand she was trying to salvage. The cameras pivoted toward her. Elaine basked in it, waving, smiling, guiding the spotlight back to herself with polished instinct. I stood still, letting her hold on to me. For the first time in my life, her grip didn't feel powerful. It felt desperate. Melanie appeared behind her face, carefully arranged into a soft, trembling expression, the kind that invited pity. She stepped forward and pressed her fingers to her eyes, forcing tears. We never knew, she said shakily. Clara didn't tell us anything. You're receiving leaked documents because someone on the inside doesn't want the consortium's lies to stick. An insider, I whispered. A whistleblower, she corrected. Someone who wants the truth out. She glanced at the newspapers, then at the house behind us where shadows moved in tense patterns. Your family is tangled in this, she said softly. Whether they meant to be or not. I let out a breath that shook. I know. Samantha studied me for a moment. She's always been our pride. A flash of heat flared in my chest, but not rage. Something colder, something older. They didn't support me. They supported the story they wanted others to believe. Samantha moved in, subtly positioning herself between us and the press. Dr. Whitmore will answer questions shortly. For now, step back. But the crowd swelled closer. Microphones hovered inches from my chin. Before I could speak, a new voice cut through the commotion. That's not true. Her voice cracked at the edges, performative, precise. My jaw tightened. From the corner of my vision, I saw her glance at her phone thumb, tapping the screen in quick, nervous bursts. That same message thread. The same unknown sender. A reporter climbed one step of the porch, lifting his recorder. Dr. Whitmore, your family claims they supported you your entire life. Is that true? Elaine stepped forward before I could open my mouth, blocking the question. Of course we did. Sir, can you confirm that I can confirm she lied? He said, pointing a shaking finger at my mother. And that Clara saved half the town during last year's power collapse. Those newspaper clippings she kept from us, that was her work. Gasps rippled across the reporters. Elaine lunged forward, grabbing his arm. Don't you dare! But a microphone caught every syllable. A reporter barked, Mrs. Whitmore, did you conceal your daughter's accomplishments from the community? Elaine blinked, plastering on an uneasy smile that twitched at the edges. Of course not. Why would I do something like that? I could see it then, the crack widening, the lie buckling under its own weight. Melanie's breath audibly hitched. She stepped back, thumb sliding across her phone again, frantic. A reporter asked me directly, "Dr. Whitmore, did your family support your work?" All eyes turned to me. I inhaled slowly. My work was classified. I wasn't allowed to discuss it. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was the only truth I was willing to give in front of cameras. I would not humiliate myself for their entertainment, nor drag my entire childhood into the public square. But that brief answer was enough. The energy shifted. Reporters leaned forward, sensing tension. Elaine's face paled, and then it worsened. A new voice called out from the sidewalk. "Doctor!" Her voice cracked at the edges, performative, precise. My jaw tightened. From the corner of my vision, I saw her glance at her phone, thumb tapping the screen in quick, nervous bursts. That same message thread. The same unknown sender. A reporter climbed one step of the porch, lifting his recorder. "Dr. Whitmore, your family claims they supported you your entire life. Is that true?" Elaine stepped forward before I could open my mouth, blocking the question. "Of course we did." Elaine gasped dramatically, clinging to the nearest railing as though the accusation were about her. "Oh no," she cried. "Does this mean we're in trouble? Of course she made it about herself." Samantha took the memo, scanning it rapidly. Her jaw tensed. "This was leaked to the press before we received it." She shot me a sharp look. "They're moving faster than we expected." A microphone swung toward me. "Dr. Whitmore, is your technology fraudulent?" The porch fell silent. Even Melanie stopped tapping her phone. "No," I said calmly. "My data has been reviewed by multiple federal agencies and 3 independent committees. Everything in that report is false." The reporter countered. "Then why target you now?" I looked at the cameras, steady, unshaken. "Because my work threatens powerful interests. And powerful interests don't like being threatened." A murmur swept the crowd. Behind me, through the window, I saw movement in the kitchen. Melanie pacing. Elaine wringing her hands. Someone inside the house. Someone still texting her. Someone waiting to hear what I said. Before another question could fly at me, Samantha's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, her eyebrows shooting upward. "Clara, we need to go inside. Now." "What is it?" I asked under my breath. She leaned in. "A whistleblower just sent us internal files. The attack on you is coordinated, and it started years ago." My stomach dropped. How many years? She swallowed hard. Too many. We stepped back into the house, closing the door behind us. Silence wrapped around us like fog, thick and suffocating. The dining table was still covered with abandoned dishes, half-drunk wineglasses, silverware scattered like casualties of the night. Samantha spread the leaked documents across the table. My eyes scanned the first page and froze. The payments, the timeline, the names. The first transaction was dated the same month my MIT application vanished. My pulse thudded painfully. Samantha tapped one line. "This wasn't a reaction to your medal, Clara. Someone has been targeting you for nearly a decade." A cold shiver spread down my spine. And then, from upstairs, Melanie's voice drifted faintly through the silence. "She knows." What do I do? She wasn't talking to herself. She was on the phone. And the tremble in her voice told me everything. The danger wasn't outside this house. It was rooted inside it. Samantha looked up at me. "Who is she talking to?" I swallowed, hard, eyes fixed on the staircase. "I don't know," I whispered. "But I think we're about to find out." I closed the kitchen door behind me, shutting out the muffled chaos of reporters and porch lights. The house felt strangely hollow, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Samantha spread the printed email and leaked documents across the dining room table, the same table where just hours ago my mother had declared me the family's greatest failure. Now it looked more like a crime scene. The anonymous email lay at the center. They're coming for you because you found the truth they buried. My pulse thudded against my ribs. Who's they? I asked quietly. Samantha didn't answer right away. Instead, she picked up a thick, worn leather briefcase sitting on the table my father's. I hadn't seen it in years. Ray never left it out in the open. She flipped it open, revealing a neat stack of papers, a business card for a federal attorney, and a sealed envelope labeled confidential. Your father didn't want this sitting in his car, Samantha said. That tells me he's hiding something from Elaine. Before I could react, voices rose sharply in the kitchen. What if they ask about MIT? My aunt hissed. Don't mention the letter my mother snapped. She can't find out, not now, Melanie whispered. My heart lurched. What letter? I stepped into the hallway, stopping just before they could see me. I pressed my fingers to the wall, grounding myself as their voices drifted down the corridor. Aunt Linda spoke again, voice trembling. I told you hiding the documents was a mistake. Documents. Plural. My breath hitched. Samantha appeared beside me silently, like she'd been listening too. Her voice was low. You need to hear everything. She stepped into the kitchen doorway first. I followed. Elaine jerked back when she saw us. Her face drained of color, her smile snapping into place like a mask. Clara, sweetheart, stop, I said. Even my own voice startled me. It sounded too steady, too strong. A kind of strength I hadn't realized I possessed, until everything else around me was falling apart. Melanie stood behind her, wringing her hands. She looked guilty, terrified. She clutched her phone like a lifeline. Clara, we were just talking, she whispered. Samantha stepped forward, her calm slicing through the thick tension. I'm Samantha Brooks, federal attorney. We need to speak about the documents your family may have in their possession. Elaine stiffened instantly. Documents I don't know. What your Samantha lifted the tablet she'd brought. Let's start with this. She pressed play. The grainy security footage began. A timestamp blinked in the corner. A woman stepped into a notary office. She signed a form and slid it across the desk. The angle was bad, the lighting worse. But the silhouette was unmistakable. My mother. Melanie gasped. Aunt Linda pressed a hand to her chest. I felt nothing for a moment, not anger, not shock, just a hollow, sinking clarity. Elaine's face went slack. That's not me. Samantha zoomed in on the signature. The handwriting matches your penmanship exactly. Elaine tried to steady her voice. I only signed what I was told to sign. It was a formality. A formality, I repeated softly. What did you think you were signing? She swallowed hard. Something for a charity board. That's a lie. Samantha's voice wasn't loud, but it carried. This document was used to initiate the complaint against Clara's work. The signature forged below yours belongs to a former energy executive tied to a consortium under investigation for infrastructure manipulation. Elaine's mouth opened, but no words came. Melanie backed up until she hit the refrigerator. She looked between her mother and me, panic rising. You weren't supposed to see that, she whispered. That stopped everything. A stillness fell over the room, so heavy it felt physical. What do you mean? I asked. She shook her head wildly. Nothing. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think I said. Isn't it? Her breath hitched. She looked like she might be sick. Samantha set the tablet down, pulling out a stack of additional documents. Your family's statements to the media don't match the public records. And the consortium's timeline only makes sense if someone close to you has been feeding them information. Elaine snapped. We would never do that. But Samantha flipped to another page. This is a call log from MIT admissions. My stomach clenched. The air drained from the room. Samantha tapped a highlighted line. Incoming call, 2 days before Clara's interview, logged as parental withdrawal. Melanie whispered, Mom. Elaine's voice rose into a sharp, brittle pitch. Clara was not ready for MIT. She would have failed. I did what I had to do to protect her. The words hit me harder than I expected. But not because I was surprised. Because deep down, a part of me had always known. I didn't need protection, I said. I needed a mother who believed in me. Elaine stepped forward, reaching for my arm. I did what any good mother would do, I stepped back. No. You did what a controlling mother does. Her hand fell. Samantha interjected, her tone firm. Mrs. Whitmore, interfering with academic admission processes can be considered fraud. Nothing. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think I said. Isn't it? Her breath hitched. She looked like she might be sick. Samantha set the tablet down, pulling out a stack of additional documents. Your family's statements to the media don't match the public records, and the consortium's timeline only makes sense if someone close to you has been feeding them information. Elaine snapped. We would never do that, but Samantha flipped to another page. My chest went cold. Who are you talking to? I asked. Melanie shook her head. Tears filled her eyes. Clara, please, who, I repeated, is texting you about me? She covered her mouth with her hand, sobbing. I didn't mean to get involved. Mom said, he said. Elaine lunged toward her. Stop talking. But Samantha stepped between them like a wall. Enough. Melanie crumpled into a chair, shaking. I didn't know they were going to go this far. I didn't know it would ruin your life. My blood froze. They, I whispered. Who's they? Mel, her shoulders shook harder. The people Mom talked to. The ones who said they could help keep you manageable. The room spun. Samantha exhaled sharply. Clara, look at this. She slid another document across the table. A federal report, parts redacted, but enough visible to read. Energy Consortium collusion. Internal family correspondence. Classified MIT interference. My throat tightened. Elaine, whispered Clara, please. But I was done listening. Samantha rested a steady hand on my shoulder. This isn't a coincidence. Your family wasn't the whole conspiracy, but they were the beginning. The beginning of the lies, the sabotage, the years I spent believing I wasn't enough. I closed my eyes for one slow, steady breath. When I opened them, my voice came out quiet but unshakable. No more hiding, I said. Not from them, not from anyone. The house felt smaller, darker, but for the first time I could see exactly what had been buried in its walls, and I was ready to dig up every last truth. The dining room looked nothing like the place where we'd eaten Thanksgiving dinner a few hours earlier. The table was covered in files, printed emails, leaked memos, and Samantha's laptop glowing with open documents. It felt like we were standing in the middle of an unfolding investigation rather than my childhood home. My family moved around the edges like shadows, quiet, pale, and trembling. Samantha tapped the stack of papers. Clara, the attack against you is coordinated. It didn't start tonight. I swallowed, forcing the words out. When did it start? She slid a folder toward me. Years ago. Before I could read the top page, a sharp whisper floated down from upstairs. She found out too much. Melanie's voice. I stiffened, listening. No, you don't understand, she said. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I told you she wouldn't just stop texting me. A pause. A muffled sob. She wasn't supposed to matter enough for any of this. My stomach tightened. Samantha's eyes met mine, alert, calculating. Someone's directing her, she murmured. And whoever that someone was, they weren't on my side. I opened the folder. The first page showed a headline from an online outlet, Whitmore's Science Under Scrutiny, Possible Data Manipulation in Critical Infrastructure Model. The article included a supposed quote from an anonymous engineer claiming to have witnessed Clara falsifying results. I felt the words like physical blows. I had spent my life fighting for precision, for truth, for integrity. Everything I'd built was based on getting it right, even when no one was looking. Now strangers were accusing me of deception. Samantha clicked her laptop. They have dozens of these drafted. Look at the timestamps. I leaned closer. Articles, PR scripts, talking points for interviews, all dated weeks before the public even knew I was receiving the National Medal of Science. They planned this, I whispered. They prepared this before the announcement was made. They prepared this before the announcement was submitted, Samantha corrected, tapping the screen. Which means someone inside the nomination committee leaked it. Someone connected to the consortium. I forced myself to breathe. Why me? Samantha didn't hesitate. Because you built something that makes them obsolete. My pulse throbbed in my temple. I flipped through the next pages. Attack memos. Financial charts predicting industry losses if Q-Core expanded. Proposed campaigns to undermine emerging innovators. And more internal emails this time about me. Target early one said, she's quiet. Vulnerable. Leverage family instability. My hands began to shake. They hadn't just attacked me professionally, they'd studied me personally. They'd analyzed my silence, my distance from my family, my lack of public presence, and weaponized it. I forced myself to keep turning pages. Another screenshot, a technical diagram that contained a deliberate error, a mistake from an early prototype one only a handful of lab colleagues had seen. Someone in my lab had leaked information. A cold chill slid along my spine. Samantha watched me. The whistleblower sent these because they want the truth exposed. They're risking a lot. Who are they? We don't know yet. But someone knew enough to send me this. Someone who'd been inside the meetings, inside the consortium's strategy sessions, watching everything unfold. Samantha flipped to a payment spreadsheet. This is the part I need you to see. The first payment caught my eye. 7 years ago. The same month my MIT acceptance vanished. The breath left my lungs. A voice behind me trembled. Clara, I turned. Melanie stood at the bottom of the stairs, eyes red, mascara streaked. She clutched her phone like it might burn her. Samantha's tone sharpened. Who have you been speaking with? I didn't know, Melanie stammered. They said it was just insurance. They said it wouldn't affect anything. I stepped closer. Who, Mel? She shook her head, crying harder. I never meant for it to go this far. Mom said it was harmless. Just a way to keep you grounded. To keep everything balanced. Grounded. Balanced. The same words Elaine always used. Samantha held up another document. Your mother signed a statement that helped initiate the complaint. She also contacted MIT years ago. The consortium took advantage of their fear and used your family as leverage. Melanie sobbed. They told us you'd get hurt if we didn't cooperate. They said your work was dangerous, that we were protecting you. Protecting me, I whispered. My voice fractured on the last syllable. Protecting me had always been the lie Elaine wrapped around every wound she inflicted. Suddenly, Samantha's phone buzzed. She read the message, her expression darkening. We need to move quickly. The consortium spokesperson is going live in 10 minutes. They're releasing the memo publicly. The room spun. They're going to accuse me of fraud. Yes, Samantha said. And they're counting on your family drama to make the accusation believable. I pressed a hand against the table, steadying myself. As if on cue, the living room TV flickered on with a breaking news banner. A spokesperson from the Western Energy Consortium stood behind a podium. We have serious concerns about the validity of Dr. Whitmore's research. Preliminary evidence suggests manipulation of data logs and potential national security implications. Elaine gasped, theatrically pressing a hand to her chest like she was the victim. My God, Clara, what have you done? Samantha stepped in front of her. Mrs. Whitmore, I strongly suggest you stop speaking. The spokesperson continued, and her family has indicated concerns about her emotional stability. My blood ran cold. I looked at Elaine. She couldn't meet my eyes. You told them that, I said quietly. Elaine burst into tears. They asked how you were doing. I didn't know they'd... You absolutely knew, I said. The spokesperson's tone grew more dramatic. We believe, Doctor. Whitmore acted with intent. The authorities should consider questioning her family as well. Melanie let out a sharp, strangled cry. They're coming for us, she whispered. They're going to investigate us. Samantha's jaw set. They're bluffing. But this means the smear campaign is fully underway. Another vibration buzzed against my hip. A new email notification. I opened it. From unknown subject proof. Inside was a single line: I have evidence of what they did to you. Meet me tomorrow morning. Come alone. My throat tightened. Below it was the attachment, a call transcript. I read the first line and felt the floor tilt beneath me. It was Elaine's voice, and she was speaking to the consortium. I'll make sure she never rises. Do what you need to do. My breath fractured. Samantha's voice echoed faintly. Clara, what is it? I looked up slowly, every nerve in my body turning cold. They didn't just sabotage my work, I said. My voice shook with something deeper than pain. They used my mother to do it. And in that moment, surrounded by lies, betrayal, and the weight of a conspiracy far larger than I had imagined, I understood something with terrifying clarity. The attack on my name wasn't accidental. It wasn't recent. It wasn't random. It was the final strike in a war that had begun long before I ever knew I was a threat. The sky was still dark when I slipped out of the house the next morning, the kind of pre-dawn quiet that made every footstep sound louder than it should. Frost clung to the windows of my car. My breath fogged in front of me as I climbed in and shut the door, the world outside dissolving into silence. I had told no one where I was going. Not Samantha, not my father, certainly not my mother. The whistleblower's message was still etched in my mind. I'm the person who watched your mother destroy your future. Meet me at the old visitor center at sunrise. I drove with numb hands, my thoughts louder than the engine. Every mile brought a memory. Every memory twisted deeper. My acceptance letter never arrived. My mother said MIT had rejected me without an interview. She'd comforted me with lines that now tasted poisonous. Sweetheart, not everyone is meant for a school like that. It's for the best. But someone had known better, someone who had been watching. The abandoned visitor center sat isolated off an old state highway, its windows fogged, the parking lot cracked with weeds. As I pulled in, a shiver ran through me. The building looked like it had been forgotten long before I was. There was only one other car. I recognized the man leaning against it immediately, even though I hadn't seen him in years. David Mercer. He'd been a mid-level engineer at a partner lab during one of my early research projects. Intelligent, quiet, always slightly jittery, as if he lived in constant anticipation of something going wrong. As I stepped out, he lifted his hands slightly, like he was afraid I might run. Clara, he said softly, you came. The wind cut between us. You said you had answers. He nodded, swallowing hard. More than you want. More than I wanted to know. He motioned toward the building. Let's talk inside. The visitor center was colder inside than out. Dust layered the counters, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the air. David set a worn messenger bag on a rickety table and unzipped it with trembling fingers. You were right, he said. This didn't start recently. It began long before Q-Corps, before your graduate work, before any of this. He pulled out a thick folder and placed it in front of me. The cover was stamped Internal Confidential, and beneath that, Mercer Investigative Notes. My heart pounded. He flipped it open, revealing email screenshots, payment logs, transcripts, an avalanche of evidence. You're the whistleblower, I whispered. He shook his head. Not exactly. Someone else is feeding me info. Someone higher up who doesn't want their name attached. He tapped the stack. But I gathered these myself. I had to. After I saw what they did to you, my mouth went dry. What did they do? He let out a breath that trembled. Sit down. I did. David pulled out a printed phone transcript. The ink was slightly smudged, but the words were unmistakable. MIT Admissions Office, incoming call, caller request, withdraw student from consideration, reason emotional instability, inability to handle pressure. I felt my pulse in my throat. My mother told them that I whispered. I knew it. David shook his head. You don't understand. It wasn't just a phone call. It was a coordinated act. And the consortium was involved. I stared at him. Why would a national energy consortium sabotage a 17-year-old girl? His voice softened, filled with fear and awe. Because they knew what you'd become. He handed me another paper. This one took my breath. In an internal consortium memo dated 7 years ago, I saw my name. Whitmore potential risk. High aptitude indicators. Monitor academic trajectory. Use existing family dynamic to limit upward mobility. My chest tightened painfully. They analyzed me. Like a threat, David nodded. They ran predictions on rising researchers. Your early work caught their eye even before you knew what Q-core was. I blinked hard, trying to process the impossible logic. And my mother, he slid over a financial log. Deposits. Small at first, then larger. Signed as charitable donations, community grants, benevolent funds, all tied to Elaine's accounts. My stomach lurched. She took money from them. David hesitated. To be fair, I don't think she knew who she was dealing with at first. They approached her through a local charity board, told her you'd struggle at MIT, told her it would destroy the balance of your family. Someone higher up who doesn't want their name attached. He tapped the stack. But I gathered these myself. I had to. After I saw what they did to you, my mouth went dry. What did they do? He let out a breath that trembled. Sit down. I did. David pulled out a printed phone transcript. The ink was slightly smudged, but the words were unmistakable. MIT admissions office, incoming call caller request withdraw student from consideration reason emotional instability. Can you make sure she doesn't rise too quickly? I can't lose the other one. The words blurred. I blinked. They remained. I can't lose the other one. Melanie. Her golden child. Her pride. Her priority. Not me. Never me. My throat tightened painfully. How could she say that? David's expressions softened. Because she thought someone else deserved to shine more than you. I shook my head. But Melanie was 17. She wouldn't have known. David pushed forward another email. Melanie's name was CC'd once. A reply from her dated the very week everything fell apart. Mom says she won't notice. She never does. The room spun. I pressed a hand to my forehead. She knew. At least a little, David said. She didn't understand the consequences, but she knew your mother was involved. The betrayal hit deeper than I expected, sharp enough to steal my breath. Melanie hadn't just been favored. She had been protected at my expense. David leaned back, exhausted. Clara, they monitored you for years. Your academic progress, your lab affiliations, your publications. They documented everything. He tapped the folder. All of it was designed to limit your rise until they could control it. But they hadn't controlled it. They hadn't stopped me. They hadn't predicted Q-Core would save lives. They hadn't predicted the president would put a medal around my neck. And now, they were panicking. And my mother, I asked, quietly. Where does she fit now? David hesitated. She wasn't just involved. She was their perfect leverage. A parent with control issues. A sister who felt threatened. They didn't need to manipulate you. They manipulated them. I sat still for a long moment, feeling the weight of 2 decades settle on my shoulders. He added gently, Your father tried to stop it once, but they threatened him. He backed down. I closed my eyes, fighting the sting behind them. When I opened them again, the heaviness inside me had shifted not into despair, but into something steely, sharp, unbreakable. Resolve. I'm done letting them define me, I said softly. David nodded. Then you need to expose them. As I stood to leave, he grabbed my wrist lightly. Clara, be careful. These people don't just ruin careers. They ruin lives. I pulled my hand free gently. They already ruined parts of mine. I walked out into the morning light, the sky finally shifting from black to bruised purple. The cold air filled my lungs like a promise. My mother didn't just fail me, she broke me. But breaking me had only made me sharper. And I was done being silent. The sun had barely risen when the car pulled up to the Capitol. Pale pink light washed over the marble steps, softening the hard lines of a place built on power. I stepped out with Samantha beside me, the air crisp enough to sting my lungs. Cameras already hovered beyond the barricades, reporters murmuring like crows waiting for a storm. All my life they spoke for me, I murmured almost to myself. Today I speak for myself. Samantha gave a short, approving nod. Exactly. Inside the hearing room buzzed with controlled chaos. Senators shuffled papers, aides whispered frantically, cameras clicked like rapid fire. Rows of chairs were filled with people who had once been strangers to me. Hospital administrators from rural communities, advocates for elderly care, local officials. Some had tears in their eyes when they saw me. Some touched their hearts. They knew what Q-Corps had done. In the very back row I saw my father, shoulders hunched, hat in his hands. He looked smaller than I remembered, but his eyes were fixed on me with something close to pride. The seats beside him were empty. Elaine and Melanie were here, but standing off to the side, away from him. Elaine looked furious. Melanie looked like she might faint. I took my place at the witness table. The microphone gleamed under the lights. A senator droned through introductions. My palms rested flat on the oak surface grounding me. Then the consortium CEO took the stand. He smoothed his suit, leaning into the microphone with the confidence of a man who believed the world belonged to him. Our concern, he said, voice syrupy and measured, is that Dr. Whitmore's technology presents a clear national security risk. Her data is questionable. He looked at me the way you look at a problem you think you've solved. My jaw tightened. He continued. We believe she falsified results and, per her family's own reports, may not have had the emotional stability required for such critical work. A murmur rippled through the room. I didn't turn. I didn't look for my mother, but I could feel her stiffen behind me. A senator leaned forward. Thank you. Now let's hear from Dr. Whitmore's counsel. Samantha stood. If confidence were a weapon, she wielded it like a blade. With respect, Senator, she said evenly, turning to the CEO, can you explain why your company drafted smear articles about Dr. Whitmore 3 months before her Medal of Science nomination was even announced? There was a beat of silence. We have the files, Samantha added. Drafts, timestamps, internal discussions. The CEO blanched. Reporters leaned forward so quickly their chairs screeched. Samantha pulled out a binder and began reading lines aloud, emails, plans, projections of profit loss. And something shifted. For the first time, the consortium looked nervous. The room buzzed with tension as the CEO stammered excuses. Those were preliminary, internal notes. This is being taken out of context. No context can alter the timeline, Samantha said sharply. You tried to ruin the reputation of a federal researcher before you knew about her national recognition. That is not caution. That is intent. Cameras flashed like lightning. Then came my turn. I rose, walked to the podium, and raised my right hand to take the oath. My voice was steady, surprising even to me. When I sat again, the entire room went quiet. Dr. Whitmore, a senator said, please explain your work and respond to these allegations. I folded my hands. For the past 5 years, I began. I have led a project focused on strengthening quantum infrastructure for critical systems, rural hospitals, elderly care facilities, emergency grids, places often overlooked until they fail. Faces in the gallery softened. Heads nodded. My work was classified, I continued. I did not hide it from my family for personal reasons. I had no choice. My eyes flicked briefly toward Elaine. She flinched. And the idea that I falsified data, I shook my head. Impossible. The system has been independently verified by the Department of Energy and validated through real-world deployments. Lives were saved. A senator leaned forward. Why would the consortium target you? I met his gaze. Because Q-Corps reduces dependency on antiquated systems that earn them billions. My technology makes people safer. It doesn't make corporations richer. Soft gasps, murmurs. And as for emotional stability, I let the words hang in the air. The only instability affecting my career came from people who underestimated me. Behind me, I heard a sharp inhale. Elaine's. Then a reporter, emboldened, called from the side aisle. What about the MIT situation? Did your family support your academic ambitions? I exhaled slowly. When I was 17, a decision was made without my consent. It changed the direction of my life. But I rose anyway. A ripple of emotion swept through the room. I didn't expose my mother, not here. Not like this. Some truths were too cruel to weaponize publicly, even if they had destroyed me privately. But Samantha wasn't bound by my mercy. She stood again. For the record, we have evidence of interference in Dr. Whitmore's early academic file. Evidence directly tied to individuals connected to the consortium. Another wave of gasps. Elaine's face drained white. The senators exchanged glances. Someone scribbled notes furiously. Then I remembered the sealed envelope a staffer gave me outside. The last-minute whistleblower submission. I opened it now with trembling hands. Inside was a flash drive. And a printed transcript. I scanned the first lines and felt the air leave my chest. Executive speaking in a private meeting. Use the family mother is cooperative. She'll keep the girl contained. Sister compliant. They won't question it. Every voice was recorded. Every word clear. I lifted the paper. This, I said, is a recording from a consortium strategy meeting. In their own words, they describe using my family as leverage. They describe manipulating them to limit my opportunities. They describe a coordinated long-term effort to suppress my career. The room erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. Senators slammed their gavels. Elaine let out a strangled cry I'd never heard from her before. Melanie bowed her head, sobbing quietly into her hands. Elaine shot me a venomous glare. You're dragging us into this nightmare. No, I said. You dragged yourselves into it years ago. Elaine opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. For once, I said, you're going to listen. She fell silent, not willingly, but because something in my voice pinned her in place. I stood, pushing my chair back. I know what you did to my MIT application. I know about the phone call, the lies, the interference. Elaine pressed a hand to her chest. Behind him, a federal agent approached Samantha. We found something in Elaine Whitmore's bank records. Samantha's face hardened. How bad. He handed her a file. You'll want to show this to Clara. My breath stilled. What is it? Samantha looked at me with a mix of sorrow and resolve. Clara, she said, this isn't over, not by a long shot. The hallway buzzed with reporters, flashes, questions, but all I could hear was the quiet echo of the truth I'd uncovered. My enemies hadn't just been corporate giants. They'd been sitting at my own dinner table, and I wasn't done with any of them. I didn't speak a word during the drive back to Vermont. The hearing replayed in my mind like a broken reel, every accusation, every revelation, every crack in Elaine's mask. By the time Samantha dropped me off in the driveway, the sun was already fading behind the pines, casting the house in a hollow, bruised light. I pushed open the front door. The house was silent, not peaceful, silent in the way a battlefield is after smoke clears. My father sat alone at the kitchen table, elbows on his knees, hands covering his face. The overhead light flickered weakly above him. Dad, I said gently. He looked up slowly. The grief in his eyes hit me harder than anything had that day. Clara, he whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't know she went that far. I swear to God I didn't. I slid into the chair across from him. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The kitchen smelled like cold coffee and stale arguments. He rubbed his thumb over a folded piece of paper in his hands. I tried, he said. I tried to stop it. What did you try to stop? He unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. A letter creased, stained with time, torn at the edges. MIT's logo printed faintly in the corner. My breath caught. I wrote them, he said. After I found out what your mother had done, I wanted to fix it. I wanted to tell them the truth. You didn't send it, I whispered. He closed his eyes. I should have. But Elaine, she threatened to leave. Said she'd take Melanie. Said I'd break the family. I stared at him, feeling the old ache twist inside me. I needed you. Her jaw clenched. Melanie stared at the floor. Samantha stepped in behind me, setting her briefcase on the counter. Before we begin, I need to inform you that federal investigators have requested copies of all financial accounts associated with consortium money. You'll be contacted within the week. Elaine's eyes went wide. Financial accounts? What does that have to do with us? Everything, Samantha said calmly. Your signatures, your involvement, your communication records. Her jaw clenched. Melanie stared at the floor. Samantha stepped in behind me, setting her briefcase on the counter. Before we begin, I need to inform you that federal investigators have requested copies of all financial accounts associated with consortium money. You'll be contacted within the week. Elaine's eyes went wide. Financial accounts? What does that have to do with us? Everything, Samantha said calmly. Your signatures, your involvement, your communication records. A letter creased, stained with time, torn at the edges. MIT's logo printed faintly in the corner. My breath caught. I wrote them, he said. After I found out what your mother had done, I wanted to fix it. I wanted to tell them the truth. You didn't send it, I whispered. He closed his eyes. I should have. But Elaine, she threatened to leave. Said she'd take Melanie. Said I'd break the family. I stared at him, feeling the old ache twist inside me. I needed you. The hallway buzzed with reporters, flashes, questions, but all I could hear was the quiet echo of the truth I'd uncovered. My enemies hadn't just been corporate giants. They'd been sitting at my own dinner table, and I wasn't done with any of them. I didn't speak a word during the drive back to Vermont. The hearing replayed in my mind like a broken reel, every accusation, every revelation, every crack in Elaine's mask. Clara, please. I didn't understand. I was a kid. Mom told me it was harmless. She told me that you wouldn't even notice I raised my eyes to her. You replied to the email, Mel. She flinched. I know. You knew, I said quietly. Maybe not everything. But you knew she was sabotaging me. Melanie burst into tears. I was jealous, okay? You were always so smart, and everything came so easily for you. Nothing came easily, I said. I just learned to survive quietly. Elaine sank into a chair. I didn't mean for it to go this far. It doesn't matter what you meant, I said. It matters what you did. A heavy silence settled, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. I inhaled slowly. If there's going to be any relationship between us, any chance of rebuilding anything, these are my conditions. Elaine stiffened. Conditions. Yes, I said simply. My terms. My father watched me with a kind of quiet awe. Samantha remained beside me, arms folded, a silent pillar. I lifted my chin. First, we go to therapy as a family. Real therapy, not excuses. Not manipulation. Elaine scoffed. I don't need therapy. Then you don't need me, I replied. Melanie wiped her eyes. I'll go, she whispered. If it means fixing things, I continued. Second, I want a written confession of the MIT interference and your involvement with the consortium. Elaine paled. You want me to incriminate myself? I want honesty, I said. For the first time in my life. Melanie pressed her hands to her face. Mom. Third, I said, full financial transparency. No more hidden accounts. No more under-the-table payments, Elaine muttered. This is insanity. Fourth, I added, you respect my boundaries. You stop speaking for me. You stop rewriting my life. You stop deciding what's best for me. My voice softened, not weak, just tired. And last, whoever you've been texting Mel, you cut them off. Melanie froze. I don't. Samantha stepped forward and placed a single printout on the table, an image of Melanie's text thread. Melanie gasped. You looked at my phone, no, Samantha said. Someone leaked this too. Melanie's face crumpled. I didn't know what to do. They said we'd all go down if we didn't cooperate. They said Clara would drag us with her. I stepped closer. Melanie, Look at me. Slowly she did. The grief in his eyes hit me harder than anything had that day. Clara, he whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't know she went that far. I swear to God I didn't. I slid into the chair across from him. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The kitchen smelled like cold coffee and stale arguments. He rubbed his thumb over a folded piece of paper in his hands. I tried, he said. I tried to stop it. What did you try to stop? He unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. He nodded, tears falling freely now. I know, and I'm so damn sorry. A floorboard creaked behind us. Elaine stood in the doorway, face blotchy from crying lips trembling with fury she was trying to cage. Melanie hovered behind her, red-eyed and uncertain. You're back, Elaine said sharply, as if I were late for curfew. I turned to her, my voice steady. We need to talk. She scoffed and folded her arms. If this is about that hearing, it's about everything I said. The echo vibrated through the walls. My father reached for the old MIT letter again, his voice barely audible. I'd like to start over with you, Clara. If you'll let me. I held the letter, feeling its weight, its years of silence. We can start, I said. Slowly. He nodded, eyes shining. Melanie lingered, arms wrapped around herself. I want to do better, she whispered. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just a chance. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned toward the window. Outside, snow flurries drifted, gently softening the hard edges of the world. I need time, I finally said. She nodded, trembling. I stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cold evening air. My coat wrapped tight around me. The wind brushed against my face, carrying the distant sound of tires on gravel and winter settling into the trees. I was lighter now. Not healed, not whole, but free in a way I'd never been. My phone buzzed. Her jaw clenched. Melanie stared at the floor. Samantha stepped in behind me, setting her briefcase on the counter. Before we begin, I need to inform you that federal investigators have requested copies of all financial accounts associated with consortium money. You'll be contacted within the week. Elaine's eyes went wide. Financial accounts? What does that have to do with us? Everything, Samantha said calmly. Your signatures, your involvement, your communication records. I followed the usher down a long corridor lined with portraits of people who had shaped the country in ways both visible and hidden. It felt surreal to think my name was now etched into a list alongside them. The East Room hummed with low conversation, scientists, diplomats, leaders I'd only ever seen on screens. But when I entered, the murmurs softened. People turned, faces warmed. Someone from a rural hospital I'd never visited gave me a grateful nod. An elderly woman pressed a hand to her heart when she recognized me. Their eyes held the truth my family had denied me for years. I had made a difference. Samantha guided me to my seat, offering a rare, genuine smile. Ready as I'll ever be, I whispered. From the back of the room, I caught a glimpse of Ray, my father, sitting straight-backed in a simple blazer. His eyes met mine, full of quiet pride. He nodded once. It was enough. Elaine and Melanie were nowhere in sight. Good. The president stepped up to the podium, the room falling into reverent silence. After a brief introduction, he began reading the citation for the National Medal of Science for groundbreaking quantum infrastructure innovation that protected rural hospitals and elderly care facilities across the nation during critical outages. As he spoke, images flashed quietly on a screen, darkened hospital hallways, flickering back to life, elderly care centers, glowing with stable power, rural communities shielded from collapse. My work, my purpose, my long nights, my sacrifices, my truth. When he called my name, I walked toward him as if through water, slow, surreal, unwavering. The metal ribbon brushed my skin, warm and heavy with meaning. Applause rose around me in a wave, pulling something deep and buried out of my chest. I wasn't invisible here. I wasn't the afterthought, the disappointment. The failure. Here I existed fully. After the ceremony, the president pulled me aside into a quiet corner. "The country owes you more than you know," he said softly. "If you ever need support for research or protection, my door is open." Then a staffer handed me a sealed envelope stamped with the presidential seal. "A federal grant," she murmured, "to establish your own institute." For a moment I couldn't breathe. My own institute. A place where no one could bury me again. When I walked outside, the cold air felt new. Clean. Like something had been sharpened inside me. I stood on the White House steps longer than necessary, watching the traffic roll past the gates, feeling the enormity of what had just happened settle into my bones. Later that evening, I drove north, returning to Vermont one last time, not to stay but to close the chapters I had left behind. The house was dimly lit, still and quiet. My father sat in the living room with a cup of tea. His face softened when he saw me. "How'd it go?" he asked. I placed the medal in his hands. "We did it," I said simply. He held it like something sacred, eyes watering. "I'm proud of you, kid." "Thank you," I whispered. Upstairs, Elaine's door was closed. I knocked once. No answer. I debated knocking again, but then decided not to. Some doors weren't meant to reopen. On my way out, I left 3 items on the kitchen table: the torn MIT letter my father had kept, the brass key my mother left hidden in my room, and a note: "This no longer controls me." Then I walked out, closing the door gently behind me. By the next week, I signed the papers for a small lakeside cottage outside Boston. Sunlight streamed through its windows, scattering across stacks of blank notebooks I bought to start drafting my research plans. A future I would build on my own terms. I spent afternoons walking the shoreline, letting the scent of pine and water soothe whatever bruises still lingered. I spent evenings sketching designs for my institute programs, for grid resilience, emergency training for rural technicians, STEM mentorship for young girls whose families didn't believe in them. One morning, an older woman knocked on my door. She was the wife of the patient saved in the first Q-Corps deployment. She held a shoebox filled with letters, thank yous, testimonies, names of people I had helped without ever meeting. "I thought you should have these," she said. After she left, I sat by the lake reading each one, my vision blurring more than once. These people, strangers, had become something closer than blood. They were the family I had chosen by accident through the work that saved them. And in their words, I found a truth I had never dared to believe: I belonged somewhere in this world. Not because my mother approved. Not because I fought for scraps of acknowledgement, but because I created something that mattered. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I closed the last letter and held it to my chest. I couldn't change where I came from, but I could choose where I was going. And for the first time, that future felt wide open. Later that night, sitting on my porch with a warm mug in hand, I let out a long breath I felt like I'd been holding since childhood. The lake rippled under the moonlight, quiet and knowing. And I thought about the people who might hear my story someday. The ones who had been silenced in their own families, dismissed, overlooked, told they'd never be enough. Maybe someone like me. If my journey meant something to them, maybe it would remind them that buried truths can be unearthed. That broken families don't define a whole life. That it's never too late to take back your voice. I glanced at the recording equipment on my desk inside. I'd been documenting pieces of this story bit by bit, unsure if I'd ever share it. But maybe it was time. Maybe someone needed to hear it. I looked out at the quiet lake and spoke softly, almost as if to the wind. If you've ever felt unseen, or underestimated, or dismissed by the people who were supposed to love you, just know you're not alone. And your story isn't over. A gentle calm settled over me. And if my story touched you, tell me your thoughts. I'd love to hear your experiences too. It helps more than you know. And if you want to stay with me for more stories about healing, strength, and the justice we sometimes have to fight for, I'd be grateful if you stuck around. There's always another chapter. The lake shimmered. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's finally becoming everything they said you'd never be.